everybody, and welcome to this session on Are You Managing Well? It's great to see you here. It will be even more lovely to see other colleagues, but hopefully those who weren't able to join us today can see the live stream or see this recorded. Thank you ever so much to, as I say, all of you for coming and for the festival for hosting this session. My name's Hannah Storm. I'm the founder and co-director of Headlines Network, a community to promote more open conversations about mental health in journalism. I'd like to introduce you to my three colleagues first, and then we're going to embark on a conversation. Just as a reminder, behind me is the QR code for Slido. We would like to invite you to ask questions. They're anonymous via that facility, because we're conscious that we can't ask questions in other ways at the moment. So to my right and to your left is John Crowley. He's my co-director at Headlines Network, a journalist of many years' experience, has managed numerous newsrooms. To my further right is Eliza Anyangwe. She is currently the editor of the award-winning Global Gender Inequity Project As Equals at CNN, a journalist who's worked at The Guardian, the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, and the former managing editor of Correspondent. Welcome, Eliza, and thanks for joining us. And to my left and to your right, Sarah Ward-Lilley, the former managing editor of BBC News, who spent many years working at the BBC and has a vast experience in the kind of conversations we're going to be discussing today. So a reminder to you, this is a conversation. Please do feel free to ask us questions, because this is where it starts. It starts in having the conversation. Are you managing well? How to start a mental health conversation in your newsroom. In the work that we've been doing at Headlines Network, we have been hearing from journalists about the way that COVID has both helped start conversations around mental health, but also make people more aware of some of the issues that are going on, and also make some of those conversations more difficult. So I'm going to begin with asking Eliza about your experiences of reflecting on this question. Eliza, what have your personal, professional experiences been in kind of dealing with this conversation issue around mental health?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for making it out this afternoon. And thank you guys for having me on the panel. So, yeah, I mean, I'm someone who personally has had access to, first of all, the fortune of working in newsrooms, the great privilege of working in newsrooms that have been big enough to offer some kind of mental health support. So I have tapped that support. I am the sort of person who tends to go from, who burns out, because I kind of go at 125% and then do that for a year and a half, and then, you know, you just struggling to get out of bed or to talk through your feelings, to process what's going on. I have tried to be very transparent about that, and when I was at The Guardian or in other places I've worked, to be able to use the facilities that they have, you know, 6 free mental health sessions, 6 free conversations, and I'm aware that a lot of newsrooms don't offer something like that. So I start by acknowledging that I myself have been on a journey where I have understood that my mental health is not a static place that you're either mentally well or you're mentally unwell, that actually, depending on a bunch of factors within and outside of our control, that we can gain and lose that health, and it's something that we need to manage ourselves and create the space for. Like, if you had a broken leg, you wouldn't hide it from your boss. So if you're, you know, having, you're struggling with, I don't know, depression or anxiety or anything, it's worth talking about. In the time that I have spent thinking about this, I just wrote down how I've reflected on these things, and perhaps they will be a useful way. You know, they've been helpful to me, so hopefully they'll be helpful to you. I tend to be someone who thinks a big picture, and so the first reflection is that, you know, in some ways, the ways in which we've let people down or been unable to support people with their mental health challenges in journalism, or just at all, is a factor of the kinds of societies we live in. Like, we live in an age of extractive capitalism. We are all, on paper, factors of production. Our economic model sees us as a factor of production. We are as good as the value we provide to the economy. That is not anyone's individual decision here, but that has a lot to do with how we perceive ourselves, perceive our role in the workplace, and therefore, you know, the ways in which we can grapple with being more than just intellect, right? and often any stresses we feel we also experience in our bodies, and often have no real way to process that. So that first point, recognizing that, extractive capitalism probably doesn't create the best mental health conditions. There are no managers in the animal kingdom. I remember hearing something similar to that. You're either the queen bee or you're a worker bee. And that person in the middle who's supposed to encourage the other bees to produce for the queen bee or whatever just doesn't exist. And that is a role that is very difficult, even as a manager, which I've been a long time in journalism, to kind of figure out how do you navigate it, because you are neither at either extremes of sort of the power dynamic in the newsroom. Add to that the fact that, of course, a lot of newsrooms don't offer any kind of management training, right? Even the bigger, better ones. So knowing how to navigate just that positionality and, the sort of mental health strain that can come from that positionality, but also how to support the people who work for you. The hostile environment is not just out there. I think people often think about, getting PTSD from being out in a war zone. If, for example, as I have seen in newsrooms I have been in, a young Muslim journalist being asked why ISIS did X or Y, as though they were somehow ISIS spokesperson, or, being invited out for work drinks and being someone who doesn't drink, or someone your boss constantly getting your name wrong in a meeting, or someone coming up to touch your hair, or these things create mental health strain that, have an impact on your ability to do your job, to remain in our industry. And it is not, I think that perception of trauma as being out there really comes from a place of privilege, where you're safe in here and you go out to a place which is unsafe. And if our newsrooms are going to change, for people like me who have experienced what the youth call microaggressions, useful to have language, by the way, but looking back at the start of my career, I was like, wow, there was a lot of microaggressions I did not have the language for, but also was of a generation, even older millennials, who you just expected certain kinds of shit at work, right? And really pleased that that is changing. I'll be quick. I'm really to speaking to what I've just been thinking about, their pros for the changes that have been happening, in that we are developing language for some of the things that we are experiencing. We're developing language. It is becoming more feasible and possible to own what is going on for you. And this extends to mental health in the kind of traditional sense, but also if you imagine as a woman, the hormonal changes you go through, even just on your period, and that being still taboo to talk about in a newsroom, or pretty much anywhere, right? So that sense that, normalizing some of these taboo subjects, but that on the flip side, the shadow side of that, is that there is a risk that we end up pathologizing our feelings, right? Now that we start talking about them, then everything gets a name. It's depression, it's anxiety, it's like something that we pathologize. And feeling the pressure myself as a manager to help explain what's happening to someone and not just hold space, but, they come to me, I'm a manager, the expectation is that I do something. And so then you end up pathologizing when you might not have the training and be in the best place to do so. The last thing I will say is that, having been born in Cameroon, grown up all over mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but living now in Amsterdam after having been in the UK for a long time, is that I think that there's also a risk that we project a Western idea of mental health across the world too. So when you have newsroom staff that are based in different parts of the world, that have different ways not just of dealing with an issue, but also of verbalizing it, we are so ill-equipped with even ourselves and our personal spaces to know how to deal with that, and yet we are now handling people who are working. I work with a team at CNN. I have a journalist in India, a journalist in Lagos, a journalist in the States, and people in London. How do we create a kind of shared understanding of where you're safe or what is unsafe, and how to navigate that, and where I can support or not, and knowing that I might be sending someone out into a society, into a community where they're ill-equipped to be given the support, or there's a lack of the kind of support that I'm advocating that they should have access to, and how that might just further exacerbate the issues that they face even.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So much to draw on there, and that point about that point about, you know, you being on your own journey as well, I think as a manager is a really key one to recognise. Thank you. Sarah, reflecting on some of what Eliza said, because I suspect that there's some of that you've come across in your kind of conversations at the BBC, particularly obviously working with a kind of global newsroom as well.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was working at the BBC, we had 70 bureaus overseas. So those cultural kind of sensitivities and the need to not make assumptions and also be careful with language and communication, time differences, all those things are really, really critical and can make a big difference here, I think. Yeah, I mean, just to fill in the gaps on me, I started my BBC career, well, my career as a television producer, and sort of worked my way up through television production and editing and into management. And probably had, actually one of the happiest jobs I had was 4 or 5 years ago when I was actually running all our international bureaus, which was really, really interesting. But throughout my career, I've had, partly because I was working in foreign news during kind of various war conflicts, been very interested in the mental health and the sort of emotional safety of my colleagues. I was at the BBC, I've been at the BBC, or was at the BBC long enough to see huge changes happening in physical safety around hostile environments training right across the industry, which was a great thing that came in the 1990s. And that was followed in the sort of early 2000s, certainly in the UK, by the introduction of trauma awareness training and awareness of PTSD, and organising more resources to support journalists, certainly in the UK and in the BBC, we made that available internationally. And I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of other broadcasters, so it has extended through. So trauma was sort of the first place we started. It's a very obvious place to start in terms of mental health. But I think, as you've said so clearly, Eliza, it's much more than that. We all bring stuff to work. We're all human beings, and you can have mental health issues at any point in your career. You don't have to have something triggered by a particularly traumatic incident. That may add complexity, but it's not the only thing going on, obviously. And I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of changing the culture and making people feel comfortable to talk about their mental health. And if you get their heads fixed, in the same way they get their legs fixed, as you said so clearly. So I think there's a long way to go. I think there are sort of 4 points I would want to make about, I'll try and be brief as well, but about sort of where we are now. I think expectation has changed. I think COVID's had a little bit to do with that. A lot of people have been talking today at various panels about how COVID has taken us into each other's bedrooms and kitchens in a way, and we've needed to understand what caring responsibilities colleagues have had. We've had a sort of, we've got to know people slightly in a broader way, both teams learning about their managers and managers learning about their teams. But I think also there's a generational shift as well. I think people a lot younger than me are more used to being open about their mental health, thank goodness, and actually not so shy about bringing this up and have an expectation that someone will be there to listen, that something will be done to help them. So I think there's an expectation on managers and as leaders in newsroom that you're supposed to take this on as part of your responsibilities. And certainly in some countries, certainly in the UK, there's actually legal responsibility. You have a legal obligation to support the mental health of your staff as well as the physical safety. So there's an expectation level there, which I think has changed in recent years. I think the other thing, one of the other big themes, I think, is most of us, myself included, went into journalism to be a journalist. A lot of us didn't go into this to manage people. I love it. I totally love managing people and working with people, but some people would much rather get on with the journalism. But you get to a certain point in your career, and if you're very good at what you do, whether you're working in industry or journalism or anywhere else, you often end up as a team leader. And some people are just not ready for that, not terribly interested. There's nothing sort of mean about them. It's just not something they're used to. Don't feel very equipped to do it, and it's not something they'd rather get on with the journalism. Plus, of course, in newsrooms, there's always the news to do. There's always an excuse to get on with the breaking story. That always comes first. So it's quite easy to sort of focus on that and not give as much focus as a journalist to the other work. I'm not excusing it, but it's just sort of how things are. And then expertise, I mentioned sort of confidence and training. There isn't enough, I think you mentioned it, there is not enough yet training for managers to help them to do this. You know, I've learnt things as I've gone along. I've learnt things by getting things wrong. I've learnt this by asking people, did that work for you? Was that, you know, what else did you need? Again, I've been lucky enough to work in organisations with lots and lots of resources, lots of employee assistance programs, occupational health, HR and everything else. But if people are too frightened to access that support or don't really know it's there and it's all a bit tucked away in the background, you as a manager need to have the tools to sort of make that a reality, what you do have at your fingertips, sort of bring that into the workplace. And then finally, Eliza's already referred to the pathologizing of all of this. The word I sometimes use is demystify mental health. You know, if you've got an issue, if you talk about it, it can 9 times out of 10 be fixed. This isn't about someone saying, I'm not feeling too good today, and someone clicking their fingers and a person in a white coat takes them off to hospital. This isn't actually about you being mentally ill necessarily, although if you are, you may need those support resources. It's actually about just creating a culture where you can be yourself and you can have a bad day, and people are supportive in teams. And, you know, in the same way as you say, if you needed to use a crutch for a few days, you use a crutch for a few days. So kind of expectation, editorial versus management, sort of confidence through training, and demystification are my sort of mantras at the moment.
Thank you, Sarah. And you just kind of underscoring again what both Eliza and Sarah have said, we all have mental health, just as we all have physical health. And I think there's been a real taboo around being able to kind of speak openly about our mental health, and it's something that I personally have struggled with myself and have had a lot of support from friends around me to be able to speak more openly about it. But a lot of the time it takes other people saying, you know, I've had a bit of a tricky day, and kind of being a bit more open themselves about things as well. Not always easy. John, just picking up on what you've heard from Sarah and Eliza, and particularly I think maybe hearing from you about your experiences, but also perhaps some of the things that we've heard from Headlines Network around managers themselves also feeling squeezed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Hannah. And first of all, it was really great to be with Hannah, where we're going to be explaining what we're going to be doing today in offering training to newsrooms. I'm going to talk a little bit about Perugia and how good things happen in Perugia through a circuitous route. In 2018, I came here and I'd just been made redundant from my job. I'd worked pretty constantly for 20 years, and I was burnt out and broken. I was absolutely on the floor. And actually, I heard you, Hannah, speaking at another session about your PTSD, which was hugely inspiring. But I was here feeling incredibly low, incredibly depressed. And I spoke with a colleague called Corinne Podger, who is a mainstay of Perugia, but she can't be here today. And she gave me some advice, because I was just about to be invited onto a network along with Eliza Anyangwe here, called the News Impact Network. And that was a 9-month kind of self-investigation where 15 journalists would look into a particular subject. And Corinne told me, she said, look into burnout, look into stress, start talking to people, start asking fellow journalists about it, because as you were saying there, Hannah, it is a taboo subject, and putting up your hand up and saying you're struggling, even though this isn't right, we all feel this, is tantamount to saying you're not a good journalist, because we're supposed to be spinning plates all the time, because we're covering the first page on history. That's what we're supposed to do, to kind of take wave after wave of stress. And of course, look, you know, this is a fast-paced, dynamic industry. We get it. You know, we get that sometimes we're going to be under pressure. But I was absolutely broken on the floor. And she said, look, for this News Impact Network, which I was working alongside Eliza with, why don't you investigate it? And I did. And it kind of saved me doing that. And from that, through a circuitous route, Hannah and I started speaking. We started meeting each other on panels, actually, and we kept on saying, we've got to do something about it, and I promise we are doing something about it today. But we formed, well, Hannah had formed Headlines Network, but we formed a partnership last year where we ran a series of workshops, 16 workshops last November for 130 journalists who told us what they needed. And this is what they said. They said, we need training, not just managers, people across the board, and we need to start having conversations. And just speaking to what Eliza and Sarah said, so many of those things that you've just said there kind of chime with me in that I don't feel I have the language to do this. I don't know how to approach people. So there's managers out there who want to help, but they need that support. They really need it badly. So what we're doing at Headlines, what Hannah and I are doing now is, we're going to be working with Sarah, we are going to be offering training to newsroom managers, but news journalists, and there's 2 tiers of that. The first tier is for perhaps smaller organisations that don't have the resources, the funding to do that. We're going to be offering 90-minute sessions where we can come in and provide help to staff, to managers. And that, when we've spoken about it before, we really want to serve news organisations that perhaps represent underrepresented communities, where they really need that support. The other tier that we want to offer as well is something where we hope that we can actually work with news organisations to deliver tailored mental health support to these organisations, precisely in all those subjects that Eliza, Sarah, and you said, Hannah, there.
Thank you, John. And yesterday, some of you may be familiar with the guidelines we launched yesterday. They're available on our website, headlines-network.com, in partnership with Mind, which is the mental health charity in England and Wales. But there are 2 sets of guidelines currently in video format and illustrated document around self-care, managing our own mental health. Because as I say to people, and I said yesterday, the first 2 letters of mental health are me. And so we have to kind of prioritize ourselves, otherwise we're not going to be able to help anybody else. And the second one is about supporting our colleagues, not specifically supporting people who we line manage perhaps, but supporting people who are our peers. That's the start of a set of guidelines. We'll be doing other ones, but the other piece of work that we're announcing, as John has said today, is this training that we're really committed to, because I think one of the things for me that makes journalism so wonderful, and one of the reasons I got into journalism, was because I wanted to be able to amplify other people's stories and create connections. And I think that, at the heart of that is empathy. And what makes journalism good is empathy, right? But we so rarely turn that empathy back on ourselves, and we so rarely kind of, as managers, use those tools that we already have, a lot of those tools in our toolbox, to be able to support the colleagues with whom we work. So just we could not have done this without a set of fantastic collaborators. Nobody's going to solve this issue overnight. Nobody's going to solve this issue by themselves. By working kind of as allies and amplifying others' areas of expertise, it's really important. We are supported by the Google News Initiative, and we are very grateful to them for this, because there needs to be investment in this conversation and training, and there really does. So I just want to ask both my colleagues now, Eliza, a couple of things, and then Sarah, and then come back to you, John, in a moment. But this is about this. The title of this session is "Are You Managing Well?" But how to start a mental health conversation. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, how do you start the conversation? And the second point I'd like to ask you is a question that's just come in. So let me just pull it up on my phone. And it goes to a little bit about what you said about, I think, the microaggressions. But how do you manage working in a newsroom if your boss is a toxic person?
I saw that and I was like, ask it to me.
There you go, we've asked it.
Maybe it'll be disappointing what I say, I don't know. So I'll start with that one, because I think I have been a toxic boss. And first of all, I think it depends on what you mean by toxic, in the sense that I truly believe, unless you are avoidant, we will not be able to go through this world without rubbing someone up the wrong way. Particularly if you are a manager and you occupy a place where you have a shared or a sense of where you need to get, and you have to get the team to that place. And sometimes, depending on the organizational culture you work in, depending on the country you live in, there are probably more hierarchical sense of how that is done. But having grown up in really sort of international communities, I just know that you cannot become, exist in a world on a level with other people without some kind of conflict. And so I do not myself perceive that low-level conflicts with a small c is necessarily all the time bad. I think what you then need is clear communication, transparent ways of addressing it, ability to accept fault, ability to actually understand that sorry is not enough, like there needs to be some kind of rectification of the behavior, and then actually usually you end up stronger for that, right? Nobody here has never fallen out with any friends. Actually, perhaps that is the test of that next level. Are you able to move to that next level? And because I've often worked in pioneering small projects or in startups, it is a really kind of, pressurized environment where, to my mind, you have to accept some level of friction. And my approach has always been to create that expectation that there can be some friction, and so here are the safe ways for us to address that friction, and we should address it regularly. So aside from that, there's obviously realities where there are people who are toxic, where there are people who are not supportive, where there are people who gaslight you, who say little mean things perhaps, or bigger problems. There are all sorts of things that happen in a newsroom or in any type of organization. I really think that point you made, which, because it might sound trite, people can forget, is actually a really important one. The first couple of letters of mental health is me. And I think that particularly the mistakes I've made in the past as a manager is to not enable, equip, and convey to my team that they are primarily responsible for themselves. We all are, right? If an organization, if a team is not a healthy place for you, please do what you need to do. I'm saying this in a kind of vacuum. We might not always be able to, right? People have to pay bills and stuff like that. And so you're not always in the position where you can act by saying, to protect my peace, I'm going to leave this organization or whatever. But at the same time, it is important to recognize that you cannot give over your power to someone else to make sure that you are safe and healthy and well. And we have to learn how to set boundaries for ourselves. And a good manager allows you to do that, recognizes that part of your job towards yourself is healthy boundaries. And I try and model it as well now, right? So the obvious thing to say is, get out of that circumstance. I know that is not always possible, but also recognize that there is no team where there cannot be some kind of conflict, some kind of misunderstanding, some kind of miscommunication. And so the important thing to do, absolutely, is to create the safe space for conversation and for rectification of wrongs.
Thank you. So ultimately, it's about communication and creating that space. So thank you, Eliza. It's interesting. There's a question in here that I was going to ask Sarah anyway. So thank you to whomever posed this question. A lot of the time we're hearing from our manager colleagues that they just don't know where to start. They're worried about making things worse. So the question is, Sarah, as a manager, I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Is there anything I should avoid asking a member of the team? And I think to that point about being worried about saying the wrong thing, can you give your response to that?
I think the most important thing is saying nothing is absolutely the worst thing. So don't be frightened of having the conversation. It's easy to say that, but I think a lot of us avoid these conversations or know people who've avoided these conversations. They say because they're frightened of getting it wrong and making it worse. And that's perfectly understandable in some ways. But actually not saying anything, avoiding the conversation, avoiding raising the issue or being sensitive to the person that you can see or someone has told you is struggling is 10 times worse. I mean, it just makes it even more difficult to cross that river, if you like. So have the conversation. In terms of how you start, I guess it's think a bit about how you would want to be treated yourself. Again, it's all about demystifying this. If you were struggling, what would you want your best friend to say to you? What would you want your mum to say to you, whoever it is you go to for support? I'm not saying we go into parent-child relationship with our colleagues and teams, but It is just very simple stuff. I mean, I was, people in the UK may have had this reference, and it's being used a lot now. There was a radio DJ, basically, who did an interview about his own mental health, a long documentary on the BBC about his mental health the other day. He was worried because a friend of his had taken his life, and he didn't understand why and was trying to understand it more. And he talked to friends about this, and they came up with this idea of the 2 OKs rule. Quite often people start a conversation or say, "Are you okay?" And naturally, most people say, again, it changes in certain cultures, but in most cultures, people say, "Yes, I'm fine." And then just keeping their eye contact, or whatever is appropriate on Zoom, and saying, "Yeah, but are you really okay?" Just giving that little extra beat. I mean, it's not the answer to everything, but there's some just little things you can do just to sort of show you really are sort of interested. But it's simply about just checking in with people and then shutting up, letting them open up. Now, they may not say anything to you at all, but the following week, they might talk to a friend or a colleague who then can talk to you, and the ball has started to roll. But there's no sort of magic script. It's just about being sensitive. If that's not your style, you'll find your own words for it. But it's about, I think, most importantly, setting the culture so that you are the kind of person that's approachable. You can't read people's minds. You shouldn't be trying to sort of second guess everybody's mental health. But you need to create a space where people are not frightened to come and talk to you, or where colleagues are not frightened to tell you they're worried about so-and-so, and then you're then given permission to go and check in on them. But it's about how you get the sort of environment and space and sort of awareness into your team that means this isn't a big deal anymore. You should be giving feedback about the editorial all the time, and it's very easy then to check in on their mental health at the same time. If you never give feedback, then there's a bit more of a journey involved. So if you're used to having conversations one-to-one, bolt this on. Just make it routine.
Thank you, Sarah. And yesterday on our panel, I think our colleague Drew from Mind said, I think on average in the UK, people say I'm fine 14 times a day.
Yeah.
And isn't it amazing? I was reflecting on how many times I say I'm fine when actually I want to go, I'm really not fine. Yeah. There's a question I've got for you, John, and perhaps you want to pick up on something that you've heard from Eliza and Sarah, but there is a question here which is perhaps you might like to answer, maybe our colleagues as well, but John is on the board for the Society for Freelance Journalists as well, and we've got a question here saying we've mentioned managers and editors showing empathy to colleagues and direct reports. It's not really a question, it's more of a statement, but maybe there's a question mark somewhere floating after it. It would be great if they all extended the same courtesy to freelancers. John, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Totally. Freelancers are the poor cousin of the journalism profession, despite being the fastest growing aspect of the journalism profession. They're not looked after. And actually on one of our workshops that we did last year, one commissioning editor said, I never used to check in on my freelance staff, but I will now after well, she wasn't browbeaten, but people kind of made the point. We say, well, what about us? Let's not. And there was a meeting just earlier on here held by the Society of Freelance Journalists where we were precisely making that point. So, yeah, and, newsrooms now can be in the mind or certainly virtual, particularly where we're working in a hybrid setting. So even those interactions that you have with your manager, we've all been doing it down a tube. Just on the first question about how do you deal with a toxic manager, I think did you say you've been a toxic manager?
I think if you ask some of my direct reports, they might say.
Yeah, because
I've probably not always been well liked, and I don't know, language is something that means different things in different places, so I don't want to assume that someone would not have probably looked at me and thought, oh, she was toxic, and so that kind of, at least a bit of humility to be like, that could have been me, and I just don't know.
Well, I'm going to agree with you. I've probably been that was the point. I wasn't putting you on the spot. On reflection.
No, not you being a toxic manager.
No.
He's saying
he's
saying he might have been one, maybe.
No. Yeah, we're going to. No, but I think I have. I think I have because, as you were saying, when you're a newsroom leader, you can't be everyone's best mate. You can't be. You're making decisions that perhaps you can't explain to the so-called journalists on the shop floor with the best intentions, but you can't do it, and people judge your actions. And actually, if you're trying to be a leader and you're trying to be everyone's friend, then you're actually not being a good newsroom leader. So I've probably made decisions while I was boss that people may have, maybe they've considered toxic. As you said, you know, it's human life. We are going to have conflict, but it's how you handle that. It's how you communicate with that. What I will say is that when I worked in previous jobs a few years ago, when a mental health issue or problem came up, the message was, toss it over to HR. That was it. It was just like, look, move it away, don't deal with it. And I think, that is obviously wrong. I think what's happened post-pandemic, where we've now got this realization of kind of what's happened to us over the last 2 years, that newsroom leaders need to be skilled up and actually deal with those problems ourselves. And that's what Hannah and I and Sarah are going to be offering to people.
Eliza, did you want to pick up on some of that?
Yeah, I wanted to share from my experience the fact that, like, you know, I was very lucky that when I left The Guardian, I briefly worked for like a non-profit, like an activist collective, very sort of like radical, and where, you know, the idea is that you look after people better in those environments, right? Because you recognize that they bring their whole selves to work. And actually, there was a lot of toxicity in that environment too. And one of the biggest mistakes we made was in encouraging people to bring their whole selves to work. We encourage them to share things that are happening in their lives that we just didn't have the capacity, the training to actually hold, right? You tell someone to relive a trauma or whatever for the sake of sort of bonding and building this team, and they do so, and then they're broken for days, and you're just like, I don't know what to do. And so we have to, there's a kind of straddling, a kind of finding, I think we're so far from where we need to be that there's enough gains that we can make without ending up in this place that I'm describing. But that I'm so mindful when you were saying, you know, that we have to deal with it directly as managers. I think that is perhaps in practice and perhaps with the kind of training that you're offering, that we know just how far we can go. Because even without there being, even if it's just a kind of like, I'm not feeling quite right, or sharing some experience, we might not be the best place and people to hold that for them. And so the kind of picture of success I don't want anyone to leave here with is that actually, if I'm not some kind of like, you know, shrink for my team, then I'm failing at this. I think the most important thing is saying, if my team don't feel able to say, I need a mental health day today, or create that culture of open communication around it, so that you can say, go to wherever the source of help actually is, rather than pretend or try and embody that, and then you're failing them and making the situation worse, and also failing yourself because you then feel that responsibility.
That's a really important point, and I think that, you know, there is managing and supporting people, and then there's recognizing where your responsibilities begin and end. And I think that, you know, we're not clinicians, we're not therapists. Some of us are mental health first aiders, but it's then being able to signpost people to the appropriate support that they may need if things need to be elevated. I just want to pick up on one final point about the toxicity. I think we've all managed people and in spaces where there has been an element of conflict. But I think a lot of us are aware of aspects of newsrooms where and I think at the start you were talking about us feeling conditioned in some ways to behave in certain ways, right? So we've seen toxicity that role modeled, which has made us feel like certain kind of behavior, which is inappropriate, is acceptable in newsrooms. So I think there's probably a difference between having managers where there's a bit of conflict and there's having managers who are role modeling behavior which quite frankly is unhealthy and unacceptable. And Sarah, I just want to kind of come back to you in your response to Eliza, because you've done quite a lot of work with mental health experts as well, haven't you, to help kind of be able to navigate that conversation about where your roles and responsibility begin and end, and how to signpost people to the most appropriate resources.
It comes back a bit actually to the first question about you know, how do I start the conversation? Because people may be worried about where it's going to end. So it's a very good point to raise. And I think I should really have made that clear. This isn't about us expecting any managers to be the clinicians at all. We're not, as you say, boundaries here are really, really important. It's about creating a space where people feel they can come forward if they've got an issue so that it can be fixed, not by you, the manager, but by whoever's best placed to fix it. Like maybe they need to fix it themselves, they just need some time, and they needed you to be aware they need to go and fix it. Or it may be that you're very much, if you're going to have this conversation, it's important that you have actually done a little bit of homework in advance to know what resources your organisation has or hasn't got, so that you could do the signposting and not go, oh, I think someone in HR might know about that. It's not really going to cut it. So you sort of need to be a little bit prepped in terms of the signposting. But it's absolutely, get the culture going, get the openness going, the communication going, and then between you and this individual, can kind of work out, get a plan, basically, from there. And I think it's interesting what you're talking about, the toxicity bit. Yes, you can't, as a manager, always be popular, because you may have to make some very unpopular decisions. But, you know, as a little challenge, you know, you should be able to retain your integrity as someone who can talk to your staff as a person. It's, you know, it's not completely binary that if you make an unpopular decision, that means you're an impossible manager. It sometimes happens that way, but if you are actually creating a culture in which people can talk about their mental health, then clearly you'll have thought about that when you're making an unpopular decision. It all goes together. So integrity in this is kind of keep that front and centre. And then if you do have to do difficult things, that's just part of it, but doesn't negate the other bit.
I'm going to pose a question to each of you, different questions. I'm going to give you the questions, let you think about them, but I'm going to come to you, John, first. But before I come to you with a question, I'm going to ask Eliza her question, if this makes sense. So, Eliza, and thank you so much, everybody, for the massive amount of wonderful questions you've sent. Hang on, where's it gone?
You're speaking first, you're just telling me my question.
Yes, I was just going to... I'll tell you what, John, I'll ask you yours, because I'm still looking for the one for Eliza. How do you, John, as a leader in a newsroom, still manage well, be a good leader for your people when you're sometimes overwhelmed by pressure and responsibility? And while I think about that one, Sarah, as a manager, how do you draw the line between being understanding of your colleagues' struggles and making sure they're not taking advantage of your empathy? And Eliza, as a racial minority, I really resonate with the microaggression that accumulates frustration and depression. How should others counteract that, and how should they notice it? I think is the question here. So as a racial minority, it really resonates with this person about the microaggression that accumulates. And how should others, I guess, counteract that? Maybe that means how should other people support those if they notice? How can you be an ally, I suppose, in that space? And I'm sorry if I've reinterpreted that person's question incorrectly. John, I'll go to you on how do you, when you're overwhelmed, and we hear this a lot from people, how can you carry on being a good manager?
Well, yeah, this is the thing. You have your task with checking in on people, and who are you checking in with? And this is a massive issue that we got from our workshops as well. And it's a cliche. It's kind of lonely at the top, or if you're near the top, you've got no one to speak to. And I think there's a big issue among newsroom leaders as well, where they feel that they can't open up as well because they feel that they're showing vulnerability, and by showing vulnerability, they're not being a good manager. There's more to say on that.
Yeah. I think just to pick up on that point is, for the last almost 2 years, I've been facilitating an industry conversation every month with some of the biggest news organisations in the world and some of the kind of leaders there. And it took me a while to get to the stage where I felt I knew a lot of these people, but where I was actually able to ask them how they were. And if anybody was asking about them, and there was a couple of moments, really, really extraordinary moments where people said, I haven't been asked that question. And it was really like, wow, gosh, goodness me, I'm sorry that you haven't been asked that question, but let's create a bit of space for you here in order to be able to kind of to navigate that. Eliza, do you want to, I know that I said I'd ask you afterwards.
So if the question is, you know, how should other people, and this is true of all sorts of things, right? It doesn't have to be happening to you to notice that it's happening. as well as if you are some kind of, minoritized group, someone may tell you something, or, if you are in the majority in a workplace, someone from a minoritized group might tell you something that's happening. My advice is that erasure is violence. And what I mean by this is, you don't have to have lived that experience yourself for you to be able to hear it and empathize. You don't have to agree. You don't have to propose to fix it. But questioning that experience negates what someone says they have just lived through, right? And that is a form of violence. And so I really think it is, and recognizing that newsrooms are part of the world around us. I think there's often a risk in lots of different ways that journalists report the world as if we're on a cloud up here, and that the things that happen in the world are not things that happen to us. And so then we look at our newsrooms and we're like, Me Too in journalism, or racism in journalism, and how does this happen? Because we've been talking about it out in the world and assuming that we are not living in that world too. And we are. And so I think really organizations that try and create the culture where there's some element of introspection and some element of changing their culture and a consistent effort at it, not some kind of, scheme that lasts a week or a year or whatever, but some sort of like core sense that our ability to address these things actually impacts on our journalism. And then in the kind of interpersonal, which is really how we do most things, it's really that. If someone shares something with you, some experience, please resist the temptation to go, really? Maybe they meant it like this. Or maybe because that, there are all kinds of memes about these sorts of things on the internet, and I can't think of them any now. But just remember, please, that erasure is violence. So, if someone shares a microaggression that they've experienced with you, I'm so sorry. What kind of support can I give you? Is there anything you need? Do you need any advice? Do you want me to come with you to HR? Do you just want someone to hear that it happened and acknowledged that it happened? Because actually, as Sarah said, just sometimes speaking about these things allows them to pass, rather than try and explain away how it could have maybe not been what it was. Because, it didn't happen to you, so just hold space.
Thank you so much. And just to amplify that, erasure is violence. And I think I've done quite a lot of work in gender-based violence. And one of the things that I find really difficult to hear is when the person who is impacted by the violence is made to feel to blame for it, as though it's their responsibility, and also that it's their responsibility to provide solutions as well. So I just kind of say that, listen. Don't ask the person what they did or why they did it or anything like that, but just listen. And thank you, Eliza. That was a really, really important comment to make. Sarah, empathy.
It was drawing the line between being understanding and being taken advantage of for being too empathetic, which is a really interesting question. I think it gets back to our friend the boundaries again, and about what your role is in this. I think, being understanding, as in doing the listening, creating that space and doing the listening is really, really important. And showing empathy is really, really important. I would never want to sort of turn off the empathy at, say, you've had your 5 minutes of empathy, I'm done. Keep the empathy, hang on to that, it's very precious. I think it's more about, if you're doing all that good modelling of good behaviour, how are you not going to be taken advantage of is the more important part, rather than stopping the empathy. And I guess it's about knowing what your role is. And the fact is that, you have got a job to do, you've got other things you've got to do, you're managing other people, and you need to signpost this person to where the help is, or say, I've got an hour, or I've got 15 minutes, or whatever it is. So you're saying, we've got 15 minutes, let's have a chat now, and let's put some time in next week or next month. But so you're not ending up in and we've all done it, I expect, I've done it myself, you have it, if I've not done that, you can end up with 90 minutes or 2 hours, and you've missed your dinner, and the phone's going mad because you're not where you're supposed to be, and you go home with all this stuff that you haven't managed to sort of help find homes for. So it is important that you're not overwhelmed yourself by the things people are telling you. But it's, again, turning it into a conversation to say, look, you've shared this with me. Thank you very much for sharing this. What shall we do now together? Or can I suggest this and signpost them to other work? Not take everything on yourself, as your own responsibility to deal with. And if it is sort of 8 o'clock at night, just say, if it really isn't a good moment to talk about it for your perspective, it's probably better to schedule it for the next morning. If you're genuinely worried about their safety, that's a whole other thing. But it's scheduling the conversation and having the conversation when you said you were going to have it is more important sometimes than being there at midnight necessarily, unless it's an emergency. So you've got to just be honest, really. And again, it's all about turning this into normal conversation, normal flow between you and your colleagues, not sort of something that becomes a huge emergency.
Thank you. I'm just picking up on a... Thank you very much. I'm just picking up on a question here. You mentioned you're not clinicians yourselves. We're not. Are your resources and trainings designed or reviewed by mental health professionals? Yes, we work collaboratively with mental health professionals, with clinicians, with clinical psychologists, with people in the mental health space. It's not for us to be providing therapy for people. It's for us to amplify the great work that's being done by people and signpost people to the support when they need it. But we can hold space for people and we can promote more open conversations about mental health.
Tips for being an effective manager, really,
effective
which we do know about.
And communicate. We're communicators, right? Journalism is about, as I said, empathy, but it's about communication. It's about connections. Our Headlines network was set up because there were so many people coming to us saying, I want to have this conversation, but I don't know who to talk to, where to start. I don't want to feel so isolated. And so we've also set up a podcast where we speak with well-known journalists about the experiences that have impacted them and their mental health. So with 8 minutes left to go, I want to ask all of our panelists, well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you again for just such an amazing breadth of advice being shared. If any of you are running news organisations and you're interested in the training that we have to provide, please do get in touch. We're on Twitter at HeadlinesNet, or come and find us at some stage somewhere in a street in Perugia. I want to ask each of our panellists, so if you could wave a magic wand and Headlines was able to provide anything for you in this space, what would it be? And then maybe if we have time, I might be able to address, I think there's 1 or 2 more questions left.
For me, I think if Headlines could do anything for me, it would provide some resources for the people that I manage that are really simple, because I think that there's often a perception that resources accumulate at the top with managers, right? And then the job is for them to then distill downwards. Take me out of the picture entirely, and I can provide access to my team. How can I give them tools that directly they can use for themselves and amongst themselves to be the first level of support and check in with each other? Because I think then it's kind of both democratizing the knowledge so that it's not all, it's just the manager who's been on the training. So then there's that sort of information asymmetry, but just and also the first opportunity to respond to what's going on internally, that power resides with them to do so. So providing tools that I can share with my team that are really simple and accessible and easy, so that they can start to have the language to look inward.
Thank you, Eliza. And just we have got 2 videos that came out yesterday, as I mentioned, and where we speak with Sarah's on one of them, amazing case studies and colleagues about what works for them. And there's just an incredible wealth in hearing from other people what works for them. Yes, everybody comes from a different space and background and place and perspective, but sometimes the hacks that other people use can be hacks that we can employ as well. John, I know you work for Headlines, but is there anything that's come from this conversation today that you reflected on and thought, actually, that's a really important thing we haven't mentioned? Or is there anything that you think that perhaps we can do better?
Well, something that just Eliza just said about cultures just struck with me, where we're so ready to preach to people, as you said, around so many different subjects, but we don't hold ourselves to that same high standard ourselves in those newsrooms, which I think a lot of you know are quite macho, male-dominated spaces. Yeah, that's what I would say quickly.
Thanks, John. And Sarah?
I think it's anything that headlines can do to sort of continue to break the taboo about this. So celebrating, on the positive side, so celebrating good practice, sharing and celebrating good practice, so that actually when there is someone who models good behaviour, they are sort of a hero in our industry. Because that's the way you're going to start to break that cycle of anxiety and guilt about raising these issues. It's just part of being a good journalist, a good manager, a good news person.
There is a couple more questions on here. There's one particularly which about just how difficult things are at the moment for covering Ukraine, and I'm very conscious of that. And yesterday in our panel, we spoke about that, and just a moment to kind of pay tribute to all of those who have lost their lives there and taken such terrible risks to tell a story. I think that there's so much going on at the moment with Ukraine after the last couple of years of COVID, of the pandemic, of exhaustion, of racial injustice being kind of brought to the fore and with the murder of George Floyd. And people are so tired and so burnt out. I think it's just really important to notice that and to acknowledge that. And just from my perspective, one of the things that hindered me most, and also one of the things that helped me most, was this idea of validation. So rarely do we as managers say to people, and it's not that we're bad people, it's just that we're busy. So rarely do we actually say to people, hey, Joe, that was a really great piece that you did. Thank you so much for your work on that. Or I'm really sorry that story got spiked. It doesn't mean that it was a, inadequate story. It was just that there was another story that was used instead. So actually validating somebody's experience and saying thank you is really, really important. I'm just going to give you all another 30 seconds or so if there's anything else you'd like to add finally. People are disappearing, that's fine. Good, thank you for joining us. Would any of you like to say anything else before we finish?
Just something quickly from me, just listening to younger journalists coming through who are so much more adept and articulate, expressing their feelings around their own mental health than, say, people of my generation, who perhaps may have put up with toxic newsrooms in the way that is not acceptable now. So let us know, and there's a reason why we need to do this, because if we still keep with toxic newsrooms, younger journalists will go and walk with their feet and go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of, there's a financial reason for doing this. We're spending so much money and resource on trying to attract young, diverse talent through. If they're just going to walk away, it's a waste of money, as well as it being incredibly a wrong thing to model.
But also your news, your output, your content, your products are going to be better if your team are feeling well supported in their mental health as well as their physical health. So there's a commercial and audience benefit in doing this work, as well as hopefully not losing people. What I would love, Pam, just to say for the last 10 seconds is, wouldn't it be lovely to come back here next year and talk about what may or may not have changed, and actually be able to converse with the audience in a way that we obviously can't at the moment. So that's a challenge for 12 months' time.
It's hard having a conversation when we can't actually have a conversation, right? So, but thank you to everybody for taking part in this. We can speak outside if anybody wants to get hold of us. We can't do good journalism, as I said yesterday on the panel. We cannot do our journalism well unless our journalists are well. Yeah. So thank you so much for supporting us and for this time.
Thank you.